For almost half a minute after beheading, a human head may remain aware. The eyes can blink. The lips may try to form words. And for those fleeting seconds, consciousness lingers as life slips away. This haunting interval likely belonged to Anne Boleyn, second wife of Henry VIII, whose fall from favor culminated in one of the most famous executions in English history. While most historical accounts politely gloss over these grim details, a closer look reveals something far more disturbing than a single swing of a sword. Anne's execution was not just a physical end, but the climax of a planned campaign of mental torment. In Tudor England, death was rarely the punishment alone. It was often the final act of shame, crafted as carefully as a play, staged for both show and warning. Anne wasn't executed simply for treason. Her last days were designed to break her spirit piece by piece. What unfolded was not just a death sentence. It was Henry VIII's deliberate erasure of a woman, whose influence had grown troublesome. By May 19, 1536, Anne had already spent 17 days locked within the Tower of London. That same fortress had once prepared her for greatness, as only 3 years earlier she had risen to the throne as Queen of England. But now, the halls where she had once dreamed of power had become a prison of hopelessness. Henry dragged out her suffering by repeatedly delaying her execution. Even his decision to summon a French swordsman instead of the traditional English axe, often seen as an act of mercy, only heightened the drama of what was to come. Despite this cruel waiting, Anne displayed a startling calm. Witnesses described her manner as almost cheerful, smiling and joking in her final hours. Psychologists today might recognize this as dissociation, a mind's last defense mechanism in the face of unbearable pain. Anne herself even joked that she was but a little neck, making light of her impending fate with dark humor. Yet beneath her forced cheerfulness, the emotional pain was immense. She knew the accusations, adultery, incest, conspiracy to kill the king, were invented lies designed to strip her reputation bare. The chilling truth was that Henry VIII wanted more than her death. He wanted to erase her completely. Anne's achievements were to be discredited, her memory wiped from history, and most crucially, the legitimacy of her daughter Elizabeth destroyed. Her execution was not just the end of a queen. It was a public show meant to convince England that she had always deserved shame. In the weeks before her death, shocking rumors painted Anne as a seductress and traitor. The tales were so outrageous, they would have been laughed out of any fair court. Yet in Henry's England, they became tools of propaganda. The morning of May 19th was unusually bright in London, a cruel contrast to the darkness awaiting Anne. The night before she had tried to pray, but sleep would not come. Records show she requested the sacrament at 2 in the morning, kneeling before it for hours. By dawn, she had been awake nearly 24 hours, exhausted, fearful, and yet strangely animated when summoned from her chambers. Reports describe her laughing with her attendants, a sign less of serenity and more of a mind unraveling under crushing stress. Her execution had been delayed several times, a tactic Tudor authorities often used as psychological torture. The uncertainty of not knowing when the axe, or in this case the sword, would fall nagged at prisoners more than death itself. When the time finally arrived, Anne was escorted down hallways she had once walked as queen. No courtiers bowed in respect now. Guards accompanied her only to ensure there was no escape. Those who once fawned over her watched with cold indifference, eager to distance themselves from her disgrace. At Tower Green, the scaffold stood ready. Unlike the towering platforms often dramatized in films, Anne's was barely 3 feet high. This low construction stripped her of dignity, forcing her closer to the jeering crowd. What should have been a solemn event was instead a carnival atmosphere, deliberately staged to amplify her humiliation. The execution was theater, a performance designed to terrify anyone, especially women, who dared rise above their rank. Before kneeling, Anne was granted the customary chance to speak. This was not mercy, but tradition, and her final words had to tread carefully. She told the assembled crowd, "Good people, I am come hither to die according to the law, and thus yield myself to its judgment." On the surface, these words seemed submissive, an acceptance of her fate, but beneath the veneer was a subtle defiance. By acknowledging the law without confessing guilt, Anne cleverly undermined the very charges that condemned her. Most notable, however, was Henry's absence. Unlike the cinematic scenes of kings watching their enemies fall, Henry remained at Whitehall Palace, waiting for confirmation of Anne's death. His thoughts were not of the woman he had once adored, but of Jane Seymour, his soon-to-be third wife. Anne's death was a mere formality, clearing the path for his next marriage. The French swordsman, brought at great expense, added another layer of cruelty. In England, an axe often required several blows to sever the head, but the sword was swift and precise. This meant Anne would die at the hands of a stranger, her final moments entrusted to someone who had never served her court, a symbolic stripping away of even the intimacy of her own homeland. Tradition dictated a blindfold, while often described as an act of mercy to spare the victim from seeing the blade. In practice, it served a practical function to prevent the condemned from flinching or moving. Anne did not lay her head upon a block. Following French custom, she knelt upright, requiring immense stillness as the executioner prepared his strike. Witnesses claimed her lips moved in prayer, her eyes darting beneath the blindfold, desperately listening for the unseen blade. The terror of waiting for death, not knowing the exact instant it would come, was a form of torture all its own. When the blow finally fell, it was remarkably clean. By Tudor standards, hers was a merciful end. One precise stroke severed her head. But the horror was far from over. Witnesses reported that her lips and eyes continued to twitch, as though finishing a prayer interrupted by the blade. For several seconds, her body betrayed the stubborn persistence of life clinging to a dying brain. The grotesque sight caused some onlookers to faint, while others turned away, unable to watch. Yet even in death, Anne was denied dignity. No coffin had been prepared. Overcome with grief, her attendants were forced to find an old chest to hold her head and body. Her remains were buried hastily in the Tower Chapel with no proper Christian funeral. The Queen of England, once crowned in Westminster Abbey with all the majesty of a royal ceremony, was now discarded in an unmarked grave. But Henry's efforts didn't end with her death. He ordered her portraits destroyed, her symbols erased, and even her name silenced at court. What was staged on the scaffold was only the beginning of a greater violence. Of course, here is the fully punctuated text, the attempted erasure of Anne Boleyn from history itself. The cruelty of Anne Boleyn's execution wasn't confined to the scaffold. Its shadow stretched far beyond her death, reaching into the lives of those who loved her, those forced to serve her in her final hours, and even her young daughter, Elizabeth. For the women of her household, her attendants who had shared her joys and sorrows, the horror was unbearable. They were the ones who had to clean her decapitated body, prepare her head for burial, and carry out these tasks in silence, knowing any sign of defiance could endanger their own lives. Some never recovered. Accounts suggest nightmares haunted them for years, and at least one eventually sought refuge in a convent, abandoning court life altogether. The psychological scars of that morning extended throughout Henry's court. The message was unmistakable. If a crowned queen could be destroyed so completely, then no one was safe. Fear became the air that courtiers breathed. A fear so profound that silence became the only survival strategy. And then there was Elizabeth. Not yet 3 years old, she suddenly found herself stripped of her royal status. Declared illegitimate, she was removed from the line of succession. Her small household was dismantled, her attendants dismissed, and her needs ignored. Court documents reveal that the child was left without proper clothing or care, an innocent punished for her mother's downfall. This act of cruelty against a toddler underscored the true brutality of Anne's erasure. It was not enough to destroy the queen, even her child had to bear the weight of disgrace. Modern retellings of Tudor executions, often sanitize what happened. They give us clean images, a noble queen kneeling with dignity, a solemn crowd, and a swift end. But the reality was far uglier. The scaffold was likely soaked with blood from earlier executions, buzzing with flies in the heat of May, and the atmosphere was not solemn at all, but orchestrated chaos. Supporters of the king were planted in the crowd to cheer, to jeer, to shout accusations. Anne would have walked toward Tower Green, hearing insults hurled at her, called a witch, an adulteress, a traitor. Death wasn't considered punishment enough. The true penalty was humiliation. Anne's final speech has often been romanticized, portrayed as a moment of noble defiance, but the truth is more complex. She had to choose her words with impossible caution. Anything that seemed rebellious could endanger Elizabeth's future, or be used to justify even harsher condemnation. And so she praised the king as a merciful ruler, not because she believed it, but because she understood that every word she spoke would echo back to Henry. Her last speech wasn't freedom of expression. It was the very opposite. It was a woman silenced even in death, forced to craft her words for survival, even when survival was no longer possible. The French sword that ended Anne's life was itself a symbol of theater. Henry spared no expense, sending for an executioner renowned for his skill, who had practiced on animals to perfect the single clean stroke that would secure his generous payment. This was no ordinary execution. It was a production. Anne wasn't just condemned, her death was staged for maximum spectacle, ensuring there would be no messy struggle, no botched swing, no moment that might humanize her. In fact, no English executioner was willing or able to perform the act. Not out of pity for Anne, but because the French technique required special training. The weapon itself was different, a blade honed and balanced for a swift horizontal cut. Unlike the brutal downward chop of an English axe, this detail alone underscores how meticulously Henry curated the drama of Anne's final moments. And then there was the ritual display. After her head was severed, the executioner lifted it high by the hair for all to see. Blood still gushed from the wound, a grotesque symbol of justice fulfilled. The crowd gasped. Some fainted. Others shouted in approval. In that moment, Anne was transformed from queen to warrior. The poet Thomas Wyatt, imprisoned in the Tower at the time, witnessed the execution of a woman he once admired and perhaps even loved. In his writings he mourned the little neck that had once been adorned with jewels, now severed and displayed as a grim trophy. His verses captured the violent metamorphosis of Anne, from a radiant queen, the center of attention and power, to a lifeless object held aloft for public consumption. Her body was hastily wrapped in linen by her sobbing attendants and shoved into a crude chest, likely one that once held arrows, before being lowered beneath the chapel floor. There was no coffin, no procession, no proper funeral rite. She was buried among other executed nobles, her grave unmarked, her final resting place obscured for centuries. This disgraceful treatment wasn't accidental. It was intentional. Henry wanted her gone, not only from life, but from memory. To the world she would become little more than a cautionary tale, her name spoken only with disdain, and in many ways his plan nearly succeeded. For years after her death, her memory was carefully scrubbed. Painters were ordered to destroy her portrait. Her initials carved into palaces were erased. Those who once spoke her name with reverence now learned to avoid it altogether, lest they draw suspicion or wrath from the king. The violence done to Anne Boleyn was not just physical, it was historical. She was erased, rewritten, diminished. But the cruelty of her death did not end with silence. In the years that followed, Henry's propagandists worked tirelessly to recast her execution as an act of mercy. The skilled swordsman was portrayed not as an expensive showpiece, but as a compassionate choice by a king reluctant to cause his queen pain. The gruesome truth of her final moments was rewritten as a dignified past. This official narrative, repeated and reinforced, laid the groundwork for centuries of historical distortion. Perhaps the most unsettling detail of all was Henry's behavior afterward. Just one day after Anne's execution, he became formally betrothed to Jane Seymour. Within 2 weeks, they were married in a quiet ceremony at Whitehall Palace. The swiftness of this transition was staggering. For Henry, Anne's death was not a tragedy, but a solution, a convenient removal of a political problem. She had failed to give him a male heir, and so she was discarded, replaced almost immediately by a woman he hoped would succeed, where Anne had not. The speed with which life resumed at court is disturbing even to modern eyes. There was no pause, no mourning, no acknowledgement of the loss of a queen. For Henry, her death was merely a step in the relentless pursuit of dynastic security. Anne Boleyn's execution was not just about death, it was about control. In the weeks leading up to her final day, she endured methods we would now recognize as psychological torture. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister and the architect of the charges against her, ensured she was broken before she ever reached the scaffold. She was interrogated relentlessly, isolated from allies, deprived of sleep, and fed misinformation designed to twist her sense of reality. These tactics, eerily similar to modern psychological warfare, left her fragile and disoriented. By the time she stepped onto Tower Green, Anne's resistance had been systematically dismantled. The execution itself was surrounded by unprecedented security. The tower's garrison was doubled, with additional guards stationed throughout the grounds. This was not to prevent her escape, but to ensure no sympathizers could intervene. The show of force for another purpose, to intimidate anyone who might still harbor loyalty to Anne, forcing them into silence. Even the timing of her execution was carefully chosen. Rather than at dawn, it was staged mid-morning, ensuring maximum attendance. Nobles gathered on Tower Green while ordinary Londoners caught glimpses and spread the word. And when the sword fell, church bells across the city rang, announcing her death as though it were a triumph. What should have been a private tragedy was transformed into a public drama choreographed to reinforce royal authority. Anne was not alone in her downfall. Days before her execution, 5 men, including her brother George, were put to death on charges of adultery with the Queen. Their deaths set the stage for hers, making her guilt appear unquestionable. This tactic mirrored the show trials of later centuries: execute the supposed accomplices first, leaving the main accused with no defense, no hope, and no one left to contradict the official narrative. To call this one of Tudor England's most ruthless spectacles is no exaggeration. 6 lives ended, reputations shattered, and all of it based on evidence so flimsy it would collapse under even the lightest scrutiny today. But Henry's government controlled not only the courts, but the story itself. And with power over narrative comes the power to define reality. Even centuries later, the truth of Anne's execution remains clouded. Records conflict over where exactly the scaffold stood. Some memorials mark Tower Green, while others suggest different sites within the Tower ground. This physical uncertainty mirrors the way her story has been shifted, reshaped, and romanticized over the years. The sanitized version, a graceful queen meeting her fate with quiet dignity, bears little resemblance to the brutal reality of manipulation, defamation, and calculated cruelty. The tragedy of Anne Boleyn is not simply that she was executed. It's that she was nearly erased, her reputation trashed, her accomplishments minimized, her very existence almost wiped from history. What makes her story so chilling isn't the swift stroke of the sword, it's the campaign of humiliation, the destruction of identity, and the attempt to extinguish her memory altogether. From a psychological perspective, Anne's ordeal reads like a textbook case of state-sponsored gaslight. She was accused of crimes so outrageous: incest, adultery with multiple men, even plotting to poison the king, that they strain belief, and yet through relentless propaganda, intimidation, and control of the courts, Henry's regime convinced much of England that she was guilty. This deliberate manipulation of truth was perhaps the cruelest cut of all. 500 years later, the fascination with Anne Boleyn endures. Her story is not just about a doomed queen, but about the terrifying reach of absolute power. Her death was not the conclusion of her life, but a performance designed to legitimize a king's desires and reshape history itself. The horror lies not in the drop of the blade, but in what it reveals about power, the ability to destroy a person not only physically but mentally, emotionally, and historically. And yet, in the end, Henry's attempt to erase her failed. The daughter he disowned, Elizabeth, would rise to become one of the greatest monarchs England has ever known. The very child Henry tried to strip of legitimacy became the ruler who defined an era, the Elizabethan age. Anne's greatest legacy was not her tragic death, but her daughter's reign, a reign that proved the power Henry sought to suppress could never truly be silenced. Today, as we revisit the grim reality of Anne's final days, we are reminded of more than just a queen's. We see the machinery of propaganda, the cruelty of power unchecked, and the fragility of truth in the hands of those who seek to control it. Her story endures because it forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about authority, justice, and the rewriting of history. In the severed head of Anne Boleyn, we find more than a cautionary tale about Tudor cruelty. We see a warning that echoes through the centuries that when power is absolute, truth itself becomes the first victim.